was silence from the Pittsburgh Steelers, whose city mourns the darkest day in its history, an anti-Semitic massacre at a synagogue that literally sits in the heart of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. Bari Weiss, opinion writer for the New York Times, grew up in the tight-knit community of Squirrel Hill. She reflects now on the tragedy and what got us here in a moving piece for the Times, writing, quote, "We are living in an age where anti-Semitism is on the rise here at home. You only need to think of last year's chants of Jews will not replace us in Charlottesville, or the president's constant attacks on globalists, international bankers, and the corrupt media, all of which are commonly associated with Jews in the minds of anti-Semites. It isn't at all surprising that these rhetorical tropes have translated into acts of violence. Now the Jews of Pittsburgh join the growing list of communities around the world that have been terrorized by anti-Semitic fanatics. From Kansas City to Brussels to Mumbai to Jerusalem, the heartbreak is indescribable." Bari Weiss joins us from Pittsburgh, and Sam Stein, politics editor for the Daily Beast, who has an extraordinary piece out today himself, joins us from Washington. Bari, I tweeted at you last night. I read your piece after not turning on the television all day because I was with my 6-year-old son, and the tears flowed. Take us through what you wrote and talk about what this has been like for you and your home.
I have to say it's very strange being here as a journalist. I'm standing on a lawn half a block from where I grew up. Our synagogue where I was bat mitzvahed, Tree of Life, where the shooting happened, is around the corner. It's disorienting. But on the other hand, you really have to have no imagination to not be able to grasp that this can happen to your community. And certainly the Jews of all people are aware of the anti-Semitism that's rising here at home, the anti-Semitism that's been a part of our history forever. So it's shocking that it came to our community, and it's bewildering, but not that surprising if you've been paying attention to what's been going on in this country.
Why is it?
Let's remember what I'm sorry.
No, I'm just going to keep going. Why is it not surprising?
Because anti-Semitism is not just a normal prejudice. It's a conspiracy theory. It argues that there is a secret hand controlling the world, and that secret hand is the Jew. So Donald Trump doesn't need to be an anti-Semite for conspiracy theorists to rally to his banner. When he says things like globalists, the enemy of the people, the international media, we can go on. He's been saying it for 2 years every single day. People like Richard Spencer and David Duke hear Jew, 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 and they're drawn to his banner. Now, obviously, he didn't pull the trigger in there on Saturday morning, but it's impossible not to see this in context, and I think it's important that we do without laying the blame entirely at his feet. He is inculcating an atmosphere of conspiracy thinking that is absolute poison, especially for the Jews.
Let me play some of that, just what you mentioned.
We will no longer surrender this country or its people to the false song of globalism.
We reject the ideology of globalism, and we embrace the doctrine of patriotism.
They call globalists, they like the globe. I like the globe, too. But we have to take care of our people. We have to. Globalists. Come on.
A globalist is a person that wants the globe to do well, frankly, not caring about our country so much. And you know what? We can't have that. You know, they have a word. It sort of became old-fashioned. It's called a nationalist. And I say, really, we're not supposed to use that word. You know what I am? I'm a nationalist, okay? I'm a nationalist.
Sam Stein and Bari, I want both of you on this. Bari, go ahead first. That's exactly what you described.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what it is. I have to say one thing just about being in Squirrel Hill and being in Pittsburgh at this moment, which is I hear that, and that could not be farther from the reality here and the reality of the community where I grew up. This is anti-Trump country in its heart. People here are decent, they are kind, they are open-hearted. I mean, I've always known this about Squirrel Hill, and anyone who lives here can tell you that. The only positive thing to come out of this is that we now get to show and model what a real community looks like to the world. And our leader, Donald Trump, might not be doing that, but the people in this community really are. And it's Jews and non-Jews, and the unity that I'm seeing here is just the absolute opposite of the kind of division that Donald Trump has run his whole presidency on.
Sam Stein, let me bring you in and read some of your piece today. You write, for those who have been subjected to bigotry, who have seen their communities targeted or secluded or portrayed as threats, this has not been a shock to the system. It's been clarifying. A moment when America's cultural warts have become painfully exposed for the more fortunate to see. For others, myself included, it's been difficult to process.
Yeah, well, first of all, my heart goes out to Barry. I'm so sorry that this happened to your community. You know, for me, it's a slightly different story. The piece I wrote was about, well, it began with a trip I took to Auschwitz in Birkenau when I was a senior in high school. And I remember this moment where I stood over the ash pits of the concentration camps where people, the dead, had been thrown after going into the furnace. And I couldn't bring myself to cry. And it was a really weird, emotional situation for me where I'm trying to cry because I know that I should be crying. And I felt like a fraud in that moment. And then when I reflected upon it a week later or so, I recognized how fortunate I really was because I had never experienced anti-Semitism. And when I went back to America from Poland, I would not experience anti-Semitism, certainly not along the lines of what people in Poland had experienced. I'd been brought up in this place where I was surrounded by fellow Jews, where no one looked at me as other. And what's happened over the weekend, but really what started in Charlottesville, is that I've come to recognize just how naive I was, that this was always there, it just never had been surfaced. And we can get into a debate over why it's surfacing now. I happen to think that the current administration plays a role, but it's very discomforting to see it presented to you just this clearly, to watch 11 people die, and especially during the performance of a bris. A bris, for those who are not affiliated, is the ceremonial circumcision that accompanies a son when he's 8 days old. In this case, it might have been a baby naming, in which case it was a daughter. But for me, my kid's bris was just, I was overcome with tears in that moment. It was so profound. It was so difficult. The joys and the fears of fatherhood just confronting you, but also the sense of tradition that I am doing something that dates back to the book of Genesis. And for someone to disrupt that moment in the most heinous and horrible way imaginable, and to take people's lives, including the lives of people who had lived through the Holocaust, is just an incredibly difficult thing to process, and it makes you wonder where the Jews fit into the American social fabric.
Bill Kristol.
You know, it's very moving comments from both Barry and Sam, but I was just looking at Twitter to see what was in the news. Just now, I'm just going to read this tweet. Just now, a Fox News guest says the migrants, the refugees, may have leprosy and warns, quote, they're going to infect our people in the United States. I mean, that is that kind of dehumanizing, combined with a president who is as reckless and demagogic as he is. It creates a climate where it is the classic climate where it's not just demagoguery, it really leads to violence.
You know, I was thinking about Kevin McCarthy, you know, and his tweet last week, which in some ways, when you think about the way in which the Trump virus has infected the body of the Republican Party, in the thoroughness of it, you got Kevin McCarthy, a guy who, you know, I mean, think what you will about him. I just didn't see this coming from Kevin McCarthy, that he put up this tweet last week that calls out George Soros, Mike Bloomberg, and Tom Steyer, three prominent and very Jewish-sounding names who are also Jews, rich, buying the election. You know, Kevin McCarthy had to pull that tweet down, took it down when he found out about the bombs last week. He had the dignity to take it down, although it doesn't really excuse it.
You call that dignity?
And well, it's better than leaving it up, which is probably what Donald Trump would do. You know, in 1996, I covered Pat Buchanan running for president, and he used to talk about how the world financial system, the globalists, it was the first time I ever really heard that in a presidential campaign, globalists. He would rail against globalists, and when he would talk about globalists, he talked about the world banking system was controlled by bankers named Goldman and Sachs and Rubin and Greenspan. And it was the most, I thought at the time, the most naked, out-front, anti-Semitic political thing I could ever possibly hear in a presidential campaign in my lifetime. And now, you know, you're hearing it all again. It's just the same thing coming back around and around. And I feel for Barry and for Sam both, as their experiences show. But it's been there all along. It is a question of why has it been raised to the surface? Not just Donald Trump, but what else is bringing this to the surface? Trump has clearly created an atmosphere, and all the things we said before are all true. But there's also something else going on.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.